Well, I think perhaps the single most glaring statistic is one that Oxfam comes out every year at Davos, which is where all the muckety-mucks get together to talk about running the global economy. And they asked how big of a bus was required to have as much wealth as the bottom 50%. In other words, the bottom 3.5 billion. And when they first came out with that, it was just 2014 they came out with this, and the bus had to be a bus with about 88 people. In 2017, they said you don't need a bus anymore. A minivan with just 8 men had as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world.
8 men only.
8 men. And that is really a testimony to how much wealth there is at the top and how little there is at the bottom. But if you want to look at it, you mentioned some of the what is going on, say, in the United States. Another couple of statistics I think that encapsulate how bad things have gone. At the bottom in the United States today, real wages, that is wages adjusted for inflation, are the same level that they were 60 years ago. So people at the bottom have gotten no pay raise in more than half a century. The group that is often associated as the angry Trump supporters, middle income, the middle class, males particularly, the income of a full-time male worker adjusted for inflation is roughly the same as it was 40 to 45 years ago. Again, almost a half century of stagnation if they can get a job, and that's a full-time worker. And this is even showing now in health statistics. As you get richer, you expect life expectancy to be increasing. It's happening all over the world. In the United States, a year ago, we got data saying that life expectancy in this group was actually on the decline. And the underlying forces were social diseases, drug addiction, alcoholism, suicide, things that shouldn't be happening. This year we got data that said this is actually life expectancy for the country as a whole is under decline. So that shows you how deep the problems are.
And inequality, as you've just mentioned, also health. So we're talking about access to health, inequality in wealth even. If we talk about the wealth to income ratio, that's also on the rise.
Very much so. So it's basically every aspect of our society. And it differs from different countries. In countries where there's more access to public health, better support to public health facilities, that disparity in access to health is obviously much less. In the United States, with its reliance in a private healthcare system, is the society with the highest disparities of access, of well-being and health among the advanced countries.
But why is inequality that bad?
Well, this is an aspect of our understanding of inequality that's really changed in the last decade. And I wrote about this in my book called The Price of Inequality. The price our society pays for inequality. This used to be a view that was sort of on the fringe, as you mentioned, and has now become mainstream. And the view is that inequality is actually bad for economic performance. In other words, societies with more inequality are more unstable and have, on average, lower growth. And part of this goes to underlying problems of society. That is to say, a divided society doesn't function as well. It goes to politics, and you see that in the United States. When you have greater divide economically, the political divide gets greater, and you get political gridlock, you get underinvestment in education, underinvestment in infrastructure. One of the things that you've emphasized in this conference is the importance of education. And one of the problems is that when you have a very divided society, those at the top don't rely on public services for health, education, transportation, and the result of that is you get less investment in these basics that make our society function.
But what about the people that would counter that with rising inequality, you'll get maybe some sort of a trickle-down effect that sooner or later that wealth and income at the top will start going down? You know, whenever you've got a growth, some early groups are going to make use of that and grow their incomes quickly, and later people will catch up.
Yeah, that's a theory. It was called a rising tide lifts all boats. That trickle-down theory has largely been discredited over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, there was never any...
We're still waiting for it.
There was never any theory, and we're still waiting for it. You know, I sometimes jokingly say, I wish trickle-down economics were true because we've given so much wealth to the top 1%, 1/10 of 1%. If it were true, all of us would be doing well. But in fact, that gap between the top and the median and the middle has been growing. The gap between the top and the bottom has been growing even more. It just hasn't been working out. And in fact, some people say it's trickle up. That money is, is going from the bottom to the top. It's going the other way.
Well, Professor, let's talk about the origins of this inequality. What are the causes? Is it the technological change that we've seen in the last couple of decades? Is it that globalization has integrated a huge number of unskilled labor from emerging countries and therefore depressed the income of unskilled labor on average? Or are there other theories to explaining that inequality?
Yeah. The thing is, there are many forces that have contributed to it. Unfortunately, President Trump is blaming globalization. It has played a role. It's a relatively small role, but it has played a role. Technical change has played a much more important role. Technical change has had the effect of decreasing the demand for unskilled labor. And because of the decrease in demand for unskilled labor, their wages go down, harder to get a job. But there's a growing consensus now that both, globalization and technical change played a role in the growth of inequality, say, in the 80s and 90s. You can't explain much of what has gone on, especially in the last 2 decades, by just those factors. And that's where a theory that I put forward, and a lot of people, there's a growing consensus, which is we've changed the rules of the game, of the economic game, over the last third of a century. And the result of this is we have both more inequality and a poor performing economy. Let me just illustrate this. We've had less effective enforcement of competition laws. So in sector after sector, you see more concentration of economic power that raises prices and lowers standards of living. We changed the rules about labor markets and labor bargaining, and that's weakened the bargaining power of workers, and that's driven their wages down. We changed rules about minimum wages. So the minimum wage in the United States, adjusted for inflation, is lower than it was, or is at the level roughly 60 years ago. We changed rules about, weakened rules of corporate governance. Governance has been a big topic at this conference. Mm-hmm. The rules that govern what fraction of the proceeds of a corporation can be seized by the executives.
Which has led to short-termism as well.
And all this has led exactly to short-termism, to a focus on the short term. You can't make long-term investments in technology and in capital and people if you're thinking about the next quarterly return or even the next year. And so that's one of the reasons that growth has actually slowed down. We talk about this being an innovation economy, and in many ways there are lots of innovations, but in terms of the growth in GDP, our productivity growth rate has actually been very weak in the last couple decades.
So how can we address this rising inequality? How can we mitigate it? What are the policy tools available to us? Is progressive taxation the only tool available, do you think?
It's one of the tools, but and remember, in the United States and in many other countries, there is actually regressive taxation. People at the very top pay a smaller percentage of their income than those much further down. So we have an unfair tax system in the United States and in many other countries, and I'm worried in the United States is it's going to get worse. But I think about it in three ways. One is we need to do more to get more equal market distribution of income. And that's where the rules of the game come in such an important way. If we circumscribe monopoly power, it circumscribes the amount of money that's going up to the top. If we enable workers to engage in more effective collective bargaining, it will raise wages. And if we have better corporate governance, we get better distribution of income. More of the revenue of a corporation can get reinvested in the firm. One of the striking things in the United States is the net flow of funds is out of firms, not into firms. And the result of that is, the firms are not investing. It's not because of the shortage of capital.
Share buybacks and all that.
Share buybacks and things like that are showing up as a significant percentage of GDP. And the third part is really making sure we have more equal opportunity. In other words, one of the problems in many countries, including the United States, is the intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage. United States thinks of itself as the American dream, but when we've looked at the data, it doesn't seem to be the case. The striking statistic is that a young American's income is more related to the income and education of his parents than in almost any of the other advanced countries. So I tell my students, the most important decision you can make in your life is to choose the right parents.
You have a lot of choice there. Professor, markets have obviously failed. There has been rampant fraud in the financial sector globally in the run-up to the financial crisis, yet no one has been held accountable. Do you see the rise in populism a direct response to that, a punishment of the elite, if you like?
It's clearly related to it. In my mind, there are several factors that have contributed to this growth of populism and this backlash. One of them is, as I say, this growing inequality that we've been talking about. The second is this sense that the system is unfair. And the fact that in the crisis, for instance, in the United States, the very people who caused the crisis were put in charge of fixing the crisis. And the result of that was gross inequities. The bankers got a lot of money, but homeowners didn't.
Millions lost their homes.
Millions lost their homes, millions lost their jobs. And they thought that was grossly unfair. And it was. Finally, there's a lack of trust because they had expected a new government, a new administration was going to fix things, and it didn't. In the first 3 years of our recovery, from 2009 to 2012, 91% of the gains went to the top 1%. So when the administration, Obama administration, the Federal Reserve were saying, we've recovered, The bottom 99% were saying, I don't know what economy you're talking about, but it's not us. We haven't recovered. And that gave a sense of a lack of trust. And there's one other thing that I think undermined a lack of trust. You had all these people at the top saying globalization, technical change, financial market liberalization, all these changes were going to benefit everybody. They were talking about trickle-down economics. Don't worry, everybody's going to do well. And it didn't happen. So, the result of this is this deep distrust of the old elites. They say, you promised these things and you didn't deliver. Why should we trust you now?
So how can we rewrite the rules of the market economy? How can we challenge this elite, the institutional and political factors that really underpin this system of economic governance?
Well, I think we're facing a real challenge. I mean, one of the things that I find most disturbing and the most difficult problem is the undermining of the basis of the common agreement about what is truth. You saw in the administration, Trump administration, when they say, we have alternative facts. It used to be we could have a discussion and you agree on the facts and you might disagree on the interpretation of what caused them, but at least you could agree on the facts. And now we have an administration that says there are alternative facts. It's going to be very difficult to reach a consensus on the way forward if you're questioning theory, you're questioning facts, you're questioning
science.
Science. We thought the Enlightenment was the most important thing in a sense that it changed our way that we think about progress, that progress was possible, the future, but the change is possible. And, there's amazing advances. If you look at the history of mankind, standards of living were basically constant for hundreds and hundreds of years until Enlightenment, science, then you got innovation, and you see standards of living, life expectancies increasing. And so the irony is here you have the United States, which has been viewed as the center of science, the center of innovation, and you have a president and an administration that questioning science. We are in a very difficult position today.
By the way, Professor, this administration has no economist on the cabinet or around the president.
Yeah,
is that right?
That is one of the most disturbing things that the Trump administration has said, that there will be no economist in the cabinet.
Why do you think this
is?
And
I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors with President Clinton. I jokingly, it was a period in our fastest economic growth, and I'd like to claim credit. But the reality is that we played an important role in that we explained the consequences of alternative policies. In the end, the president and the cabinet, made the decision, but at least everybody got the view of how this complex economic system works. Businessmen, if you're buying and selling real estate, you may be a good business person, you may not be, but you may deal with dishonestly, but that's a different matter. But buying and selling property is different from understanding how a complex economic system works. And having an administration in which there is no one who really understands that is very deeply worrisome.
Mm-hmm. We've spoken about technical change or technological change. There's a lot of talk in the past 2 years on the fourth industrial revolution. Do you think that artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, virtual reality, 3D printing, and what have you, will have that same disruptive effect on our economies as, say, the steam engine or electricity or even toilets and sanitation?
Well, there's a big debate about this in economics. I think the general consensus is that toilets and electricity were much more important than Facebook. I hope I haven't insulted anybody here, but that those innovations really did change our standards of living, increased health. Having a better advertising engine is important for advertising, but doesn't really fundamentally change in a deep way our standard of living. But you mentioned, the fourth industrial revolution, where we have machines that have the ability not only to be stronger than humans, to think faster, even to have artificial intelligence so they can analyze problems. That may fundamentally change the way our economy and society functions.
In a destructive way to jobs in particular?
Well, that's the real concern. What will it do to jobs? And the techno-optimists say, don't worry, look back in the inventions of the cars. Yes, buggy whips and lots of other things, jobs got destroyed, but we created far more jobs in car repairs and the whole industries, and our standard of living went up.
Will it be the case this time?
But we don't know. That's what worries. And even, techno-optimists that I've talked to, people who had Google and other of these Silicon Valley firms, 5 years ago they were very optimistic. Today they're not so sure. I mean, give you one example. There is the belief that within 5 years, all the trucks in the United States will be self-driven. Now that may be an optimistic timeline. It may be 10 years. Truck driving is one of the main occupations of relatively unskilled workers. It takes some skill to drive a truck, but it isn't the high skill that, computer programmer. And the worry is, what kinds of jobs will these people, they've lost their manufacturing jobs. Global employment in manufacturing is on the decline. And they're now going to be losing their truck driving jobs. What will the jobs be that society will be able to bring to them? And if we don't answer that question well, the problems of inequality that we talked about in the beginning will only get worse.
The Trump administration, it might well turn on the Paris climate deal. Do you figure international sanctions on the US or on American companies is an appropriate response to disincentivize the US and maybe change its mind on this issue?
Well, I wouldn't say just on the US. I think the international community should be at the point where they say we need cross-border taxes on any country that isn't playing its role in addressing climate change. And that means if you walk away from Paris, there should be sanctions. There should be cross-border taxes on the polluting goods. We can't let one country play by one rules and the rest of the world playing by other rules. That would be unfair competition. And my analysis of the WTO is that that kind of enforcement of an international agreement, if it's done uniformly, is actually consistent with WTO rules. So I think that one has to incentivize. We did it, for instance, when it came to the ozone-destroying gases, when there was a realization that those gases that destroyed the ozone were causing cancer, a real threat to well-being. And in Montreal, there was an agreement, and they said any country that didn't go along with that, there would be sanctions. And it worked. And this is a more difficult problem, and progress has been slower, but in my mind, we are at the point where the problem is so critical, the urgency of dealing with it is so great, that we really ought to begin to think about that kind of policy.
Finally, Professor, a question for the future. will the debate going forward be a two-sided one? The elites on the one side, the old guard on the one side, versus the populists on the other? Are you optimistic that there's a third alternative way, middle of the road way, which is going to be able to claim its stake in the debate eventually?
Yes, I am very optimistic about a third way. There's always been a discussion of the third way, but sometimes the third way was not the right third way. The discussion of the concept of the third way was when the Iron Curtain fell. It was very clear that that kind of government-run way was not going to work. And on the other hand, it's very clear, 2008 crisis, and even before that, unfettered markets are not the solution. So between those two, there needs to be a third way. But the particular third way that many countries chose, where you basically had close to unfettered markets, where you didn't pay any attention to inequality, where you didn't pay any attention to access to health, to education, to intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage. You didn't pay any attention to the environment. That's not adequate for the 21st century. And one of the things that's heartened me in this cloud of Trump and protectionism and all that is the response inside America to what has been going on. There is a sense of solidarity that I think I have not seen, maybe since Martin Luther King, and 50 some years ago. That was a moment back then, and I was down at that march with Martin Luther King. There was a sense of unity where it was about civil rights and it was about equality of opportunity for everybody. It was about jobs and economic empowerment. And the country was fairly united, and there were large changes that occurred in the period after that. And now we're seeing the same thing, the same kind of unity about, you might say, a progressive agenda, that you need access to education, to higher education, in this world, that you can't have universities like Trump universities around to exploit people. You have to have really high quality public education for all. That you need access to health care for all, access to housing. So that there is a consensus developing around the elements of the third way. Of course, there's going to be discussions about the best way of achieving this, but that the system that seemed to be working from, say, 1990, from the fall of the Iron Curtain until 2008, that period, that model is broken. And as we realize that a new model is needed, and I think we have the elements of that new model, and what will go on in different countries with different experiments, and we'll see which of those are more successful. In different countries, we'll find that their mix for them is different, and they'll each find their way.
Let's hope they build this model fairly quickly. I'm afraid that's all the time we've got today. It's been a great honor, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz, everyone, thank you very much.